and check to make sure it's working all right. I always give it a few minutes to make sure that the audience can hear us, because there's been a few times where it's messed up, and that was always bad when that happens. Social media, my channel.
Zeus, you can be sure that there's
All right, it looks like we're live. So, Tim, thanks for coming on and being willing to have a conversation with me. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on my channel. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure, yeah. My name is Tim, and I'm really nobody in particular. I'm not a professor. I don't have a doctorate. I'm not a pastor. I'm just a guy. Back in 1997, I was drowning in guilt, and for me to be guilty, there had to be a transcendent prescriptive will that I'd violated. In other words, I made myself an enemy of God, and I knew that if I was the problem, then I was not the solution. I was people would phrase it like this: I was a sinner in need of a savior. Well, roughly 2,000 years ago, there was this guy named Jesus, and he promised everybody a couple of different things that I found really, really relevant to my situation. First of all, he promised that he had the ability to forgive our sins. And second of all, he promised that if we trust him, he was willing to forgive our sins. So he promised that he had both the ability and the desire or the love for us to do this. Now, when he made those promises, the culture that he was in believed that permanent death was the punishment for sins. So to demonstrate to them that he really could make good on these promises, he showed that he had power over the penalty of sins by rising from the dead. If you have power over the penalty, then you can ultimately forgive the sin, or at least that seems to follow. So anyway, seeing that this is what happened, appears to have been what happened, I turned to Jesus and I trusted him with my life, with my future, with my eternity. And the internal changes in me that act of trusting Christ brought about, those are things that my own will, working all by itself, just could never have made happen. So anyway, that's who I am. So now, is it correct that you also, like me, believe in transcendent moral laws, a transcendent moral code or moral rules that transcend all humans? Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say there's an objective moral system. I don't know exactly what transcend means, but I would definitely say there is an objective moral system of values. Um, but just to jump right in, so I'm an atheist, by which I believe there is no reason to believe in a God. I believe there is no God, and I think that naturalism is a better explanation for everything we see of reality and gives us a more accurate view of reality. Could you tell me some of the reasons that you believe there is for belief in God? You mentioned that your personal experience is one. Is that the primary reason you would believe in a God?
Um, let's see. For me, I guess it comes down to I have a whole bunch of different reasons. For my own personal belief, but there I would draw a distinction between why I personally have chosen to believe in God or have come to the conclusion that God exists versus why I think maybe somebody else should. For example, the changes internal to me that came about as a result of my faith in Christ are certainly very convincing to me. I don't expect anybody else to be convinced by that, because I don't think that my external behavior really changed all that much. My motivations changed, but I don't expect anybody to be aware of what my motivations were before and what they have been afterwards. But for me, that's a very, very powerful evidence. If the Christian God exists, if the claims of Christianity are true, then we would expect when somebody accepts faith in Jesus Christ that there would be internal changes. And that's what I experienced. So it was predictive, and it fulfilled that prediction for me. But going back to the whole transcendent moral laws thing. So you said that you believe in, how did you phrase it? Objective moral code, objective moral system.
Yeah, objective morality. It's called moral realism in philosophy. I'm a moral realist.
Okay. So by objective, can you kind of flesh out what you mean by objective?
Mind independent. It's true regardless of what anybody says or thinks. It's just like a fact of nature, like a law of nature, physics, math, logic, those things that are true regardless of anyone's opinion, perspective, intuitions, those kinds of things.
Okay. So by a law of nature, like often when we talk of law of nature, in my experience, we're talking about something like gravity, which would be descriptive, as opposed to something like moral laws, which would be prescriptive.
Well, I would reject that. So I would say moral laws are also descriptive. Prescriptions are something we impose on them.
Okay, I guess I'm not following you. So you're saying that I've heard you say it's always wrong to kill a baby. Is that something you would still
Yes.
affirm as an example of one of these moral laws, so to speak?
Yeah, I think I usually say drown a baby, specifically referencing the Old Testament. But yeah.
Okay. So it's always wrong to drown a baby.
Yeah.
Okay. So would you say then that drowning babies is something that then never happens, or something that never ought to happen?
I would say that if it happens, that would make it immoral. So I'd say that if someone drowns a baby, then that describes the fact that they are immoral.
Okay. So I guess what I'm hearing from you is that people ought not drown babies.
Well, no, the ought is irrelevant. So it's like if I'm 6 feet tall, it's not that I ought to be 6'1" or 5'9". It's a descriptive fact that I am 6 feet tall. So if someone drowns babies, it is simply a descriptive fact they are immoral. The oughts are then saying, well, it would be better if we didn't do that, which I agree with. I think it would be better, but the objective moral fact can't have any oughts in it because that would make it subjective. So for it to be an objective moral fact, it has to simply describe the fact that if someone is drowning babies, they're immoral. And that's what moral facts are telling us. The oughts then are added in after that.
Okay. So the idea that a person ought not drown babies is not what you're claiming exists in some sort of objective sense. Rather, it's a person who drowns babies is immoral. And by immoral, I guess, what do you mean by that? Like they're not following what they ought to follow, right?
No, again, so oughts are out of the question. It's simply descriptive. So when I say moral statement is objective, I mean, specifically in my model, I'm referencing an abstract object, which I call the best of all possible worlds. So I say, if you do an immoral action, you're doing an action that would move us away or further away from the best of all possible worlds. And if you're doing a moral action, it moves us towards the best of all possible worlds. So if you're drowning babies, that's immoral. And the fact that it's immoral describes the fact that it's moving us away from the best way the world could be.
Okay. So, and by best, that's best from whose perspective?
That's just a label I'm giving it, the best of all possible worlds. So it's not actually important to the model. So it's just saying that in my model, the best of all possible worlds is one where there is no involuntary imposition of will. That's how I define best. But it's essentially just meaning that an immoral action is one in which you involuntarily impose on someone without their consent. And I'm defining the best world as a world that doesn't have any of that.
Okay, so it sounds like this whole definition of this objective morality is just something that you've just come up with on your own. Is that what you're saying? Like you're making the definitions?
No, again, so all scientific discoveries are somebody made them up, but they're observing some phenomenon in the world and then using the phenomenon we observe to come up with principles, and then those principles are describing the phenomenon in reality. So I can create F equals ma, like Newton. That isn't just something I made up. It's something I made up to describe something that actually exists. So morality, like the immorality I'm describing, is like that. It is a descriptive term that I made up to describe something that is objectively true.
So, but the best possible world, you said that you just kind of made up what that was, or unless I totally misunderstood you.
Oh, no. So I'm following the evidence. So the evidence is moral intuition and moral progress. If we look at our moral intuitions and we look at moral progress and we plot it out on a line graph and then draw a line to see where does it go, the world that it leads to or what it indicates is the best of all possible worlds. That's how I got to that as the ideal standard of morality.
Okay, so no involuntary imposition of will is what I guess I'm struggling with the whole ought thing. I don't know how to even talk about this without using the word ought. So
well, you can. So oughts apply. They're just they go after the fact. So if I say, if you drown a baby, you're immoral, that's just a descriptive fact of the situation. Therefore, you ought not to drown babies. That's totally fine. But the ought isn't contingent on the statement. It's objectively immoral, just a descriptive fact about you. And then the fact that you ought not do it is an additional fact. It's not required for the morality. It's just an additional description of the morality.
So how is something immoral if it's not the case that you ought not do it? What does it mean to say that it's immoral?
Well, no, so it's not immoral because you ought not do it. It's immoral, therefore you ought not do it. So the fact that you ought not do it isn't what causes it to be immoral. It's a response after the fact it's immoral. So what makes it immoral is the fact that it moves us away from the best of all possible worlds. So oughts are always, the prescriptive things are always come after. Nothing is immoral because we ought not do it. That would be backwards. We ought not do something because it's immoral.
What I think I'm hearing you say is that from your perception, based on your moral intuition, drowning a baby or an involuntary imposition of will is always wrong. That's your moral intuition.
Sort of, but again, so my moral intuition is irrelevant here. I'm talking about if we look at moral intuitions of every human being on the planet and the moral progress of every society on the planet, we plot those out on a number line, then what we get is the model of the best of all possible worlds. So my intuition, it just doesn't matter. That's just my subjective perspective on the matter. But I'm going off of the objective context of everyone's moral intuition and moral progress. And if you plot all of that out, you get a conclusive indication of one direction, which is what I call the best of all possible worlds. And then I use that, which is the accumulation of all the evidence, as the basis of morality. It's not, my intuition isn't particularly important. But yes, I would say that I intuitively think that killing babies is wrong.
Okay, so your perspective then is that everyone's moral intuition kind of taken together, averaged and whatnot, and then looked at over time and sort of mapped out on a chart of some kind, winds up pointing towards a world in which there's no involuntary imposition of will.
Yeah.
Okay, and so you're using the words moral and morality and immorality to describe that sort of chart and graph. Is that correct?
I think so.
Okay, or to label the chart and the graph. Okay, so this idea of no involuntary imposition of will, would that mean like owning a house cat is morally wrong?
Sort of. So like ownership is a pretty vague term, but like just having a cat in your home wouldn't be immoral. Forcing the cat to suffer against its will would be immoral. But ownership.
Well, I mean, what if the cat wants to go out, but you've taken off its claws and you know that it would die if it goes outside and it's meowing at the door and you won't let it out? Is that an involuntary imposition of will that's morally wrong?
Yes, so it would be involuntary. It would be immoral to force the cat to remain in your home against its will. That is true.
So would it be immoral to prevent the cat from coming into your home if it's a stray cat and it wants to come in?
No, because it's your property, your home.
But it's its will to come into your home, and
that doesn't matter. Consent only applies to yourself and your property. So someone else, like a cat or whatever, can't consent to enter your home. They would need your consent to do that. So it's not an involuntary imposition on your stuff if it's your stuff. So you can't consent or will for someone else's will or consent to do something. It only applies to yourself and your property. So the cat can consent to do what it wants with itself and its property, but it can't will to do things with you or your property. It doesn't apply that way.
Okay, but does the cat doesn't have a concept of property? That's kind of a human, or maybe it does have a concept of property. Like, have I taken its property by building my house there, or what gives me that property? And it's not allowed to claim the same property for itself.
Well, that's a different topic. That's ownership rights. We can define that in different ways, but that's not really relevant to the point. The only thing that matters is that there is property rights, essentially. And if you have some set of property, then you get to dictate how that's used, and someone else cannot violate that thing. Now, how that's determined is pretty irrelevant to the model. All that matters is that there is such a thing.
Okay, so in your view, then, God drowning all of the babies in the world would not be morally wrong since they're his property. Is that correct?
No, because you can't own someone else. Each of those babies has themselves as part of their property. So you can't actually have ownership rights of someone else. That was the whole point of the cat analogy, is that consent only applies to yourself and your property. Someone else, by definition, is their own property. You can't own them in that way. So you don't get to consent on their behalf. So that is always immoral to do that.
Okay. Do you think that George Lucas killing all of the babies on Alderaan, that was an involuntary imposition of will?
No, I don't think any of them were conscious.
Okay. So if Luke Skywalker told Darth Vader that Princess Leia is not conscious, do you think that Luke Skywalker would have been speaking accurately?
Yes.
Okay, so if you saw that in a movie, you wouldn't be like, what? Why is he saying that? That's not right.
Yeah, it'd be weird in the context of the movie, but it would be literally correct. It would be figuratively awkward, but literally correct. I'm not sure what your point is there.
Oh, well, okay. So my point is that there are different contexts. And when an author comes up with a narrative and a plot and characters and so on and so forth, and then he causes them to suffer within that context, then we don't consider that to be immoral.
That's because none of them exist. They're all imaginary creatures. They don't have consciousness. Like if we could write a story and actually create beings to live in the story and they were real, and then we force them to suffer, that would absolutely be immoral. And that's a really common theme in sci-fi movies, specifically like the Twilight Zone and other fictional stories where I think there's an anime actually about this a few years ago where they had characters in stories that would come to life, and they'd actually live out the stories in another world where these writers were actually creating alternative worlds without realizing it, and the characters in those stories were real and existed and had consciousness and suffered, and it explored the morality of that and how immoral it is to actually create a world of beings and force them to suffer. Like that is terribly immoral. The fact that you created them is irrelevant. The fact that they have consciousness is the only thing that matters. If they are conscious, it is immoral to make them suffer regardless of who created them.
So I suppose I'm not really sure what you mean by consciousness. It seems to me that in the context of like the Star Wars universe, Luke would say that Leia has consciousness. Leia would say that Vader has consciousness, and if they said otherwise, we would think that they're wrong, that what they're saying is false.
Well, consciousness is qualia experience. So none of the characters in stories have qualia experience.
In the story, they do.
In the story, yeah, but in the story, they don't exist. So the story is a fictional thing. In the context
of the story, they do exist.
In the context of the story, doesn't matter because all that matters is objectively, do they have consciousness? In the context of the story, they may have the perception of consciousness, but that doesn't matter to objective morality because objective morality only applies to things that ontologically do have consciousness.
Okay, so I guess from my perspective, if you were, and I don't know that you are, but if you were criticizing my personal worldview, then if the accusation was that my God, the God that I believe in, killed a bunch of babies in the flood, for example, and therefore is objectively immoral, it would seem to me that that's a straw man because the connection between the association, the relationship between the God that I believe in, Yahweh, and his creation is akin or analogous to the relationship between George Lucas and his creation or Mark Twain and his creation. It's analogous. So in the sense that with respect to George Lucas, Luke Skywalker does not exist. I can agree with that. Luke Skywalker is fiction to George Lucas. Likewise, with respect to Yahweh, you and I are fiction with respect to Yahweh. We are effectively made up out of whole cloth. We're his imagination. So if it's wrong for Yahweh to kill the babies that he invented, then it's also wrong for George Lucas to kill the babies that he invented because it's the same kind of relationship there. At least I would think that would follow. I would need some sort of reason to see that as something other than special pleading.
Right. So this isn't an internal. I'm not making an internal critique of Christianity. I'm saying I have a standard of objective morality, and I can say that any time you impose on a will without his consent is objectively immoral. So if the babies did exist and weren't fictional characters, then God drowning them would be immoral. It'd be objectively immoral. Put it into the context of a story makes no difference to my model. If they're conscious, they have moral rights, and violating those rights is immoral. So if you want to put it in the context of Christianity and say that we are like the characters of George Lucas's story, well, I would just say that's obviously wrong. Like I'm conscious, I'm a moral agent. So if you want to try to say that conscious agents don't have moral agency because they are in the context of a story, that makes morality arbitrary, and it invalidates all morality completely and makes it useless. So if you want to argue that because we are characters in God's story, therefore morality does not apply to us, that just invalidates all morality and it's arbitrary. So it seems very strange that your case gets rid of all moral obligation completely and just says, well, we just do what God says, because that is the Euthyphro dilemma, essentially. So from my perspective, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
All right. Yeah, so from my perspective, morality applies to any conscious agent. And that seems to be what all of the evidence indicates. And if you're going to reject that and say, well, there's an exception that it doesn't apply to conscious agents if they are a product of a story, that seems to be the special pleading.
So are you saying that it was not wrong for Palpatine to kill all of the babies on Alderaan?
No, they don't exist. They never, there's no consciousness there.
Okay. So I think that probably Luke and Leia would disagree with you. I mean, again, in the context of their narrative.
Well, Luke and Leia can't disagree. They don't exist.
If we were watching the Star Wars movie and Luke said, oh yeah, there's nothing wrong with Palpatine killing all of these babies or Vader killing all the babies or however it was that it played out on Alderaan,
No, then they
We
just
would
say
disagree
whatever
with
the writer told them to say because they have no consciousness. So again,
right.
there isn't any
Disagree.
congruence there. It's just
And
conflating
we
the
would disagree
fictional.
with them. That's the point. We would disagree with him. We would be like, why is he lying? Why is he saying this? Why has he turned to the dark side? Because obviously what he's saying would be false in their context, because it is wrong for Palpatine to kill all of those babies, to obliterate the entire planet. And we
If they
understand that
exist.
to be wrong.
But no. So like in video games, we kill lots of people all the time, and we don't see any problem with it at all. Like there's no discongruence there at all. I mean, there are many characters in video games who say we should kill all of these people, and we don't think they're immoral because none of them exist. They're just written to say that. So if they said incongruent things like I am a square circle or whatever, it would seem weird, but we'd know that was just the writer saying that. So the analogy you're making just completely fails because we know none of them have consciousness. If they did, then it would be immoral. But, and again, so I think you're conflating our perspective with the ontology of morality. So I'm saying ontologically, it's immoral to harm anything with consciousness. Now, whether or not we would see things as having consciousness, like in a movie or not, is irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether, like if we thought Luke and Leia were conscious, and we thought the people on Alderaan were conscious, and we thought it was therefore immoral to blow up Alderaan, none of that matters. What we think is irrelevant, because objective morality is, if they have consciousness, it's immoral to harm them. But as long as they don't have consciousness, what we think is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what our perspective is.
So I guess I don't think that anyone quite agrees with what you're saying. I don't think that even you do, because I think, again, if you're watching the movie and you see they kill all of these people, you're thinking, well, they shouldn't have done that. And that's what the author of the movie wants you to think. And that is what you think. Otherwise, you don't even enjoy the movie. Like the movie is just kind of...
Right. But again, what we think doesn't matter to moral ontology. What is the case morally is irrelevant to what we think is the case. What I think is the case in the movie, whether I'm totally engaged and think it's wrong to kill all the children in Alderaan, it's not immoral because there is no conscience there. Objectively, it's not immoral.
Well, so I would agree that objectively it's not immoral for George Lucas to kill them. But I would agree that in the universe that George Lucas created, he caused it to be immoral for Palpatine to kill them.
He caused that perception, but again, the perception is irrelevant. So the perception is not relevant to the ontology. Like I can see an optical illusion, but that doesn't tell me anything about the actual shape of the object. So our perception of morality is irrelevant to the actual morality.
Except that you're basing morality on your perception and everybody else's perception.
No, I'm basing it on moral intuition and moral progress. That's not a perception. That's something that exists in the world that we can actually...
Okay, moral intuition is merely perception, correct? Moral progress
No, again, so the fact that
progress.
a person has a moral intuition is their perception. The fact that humans have moral intuition is just an objective fact. So I'm not basing it off of a perception. I'm basing it off of the cumulative case of perceptions and how they seem to indicate and change in the world.
Okay, so based upon your observation of people's perception, you come to the conclusion that there is this objective moral system.
Yeah.
And perception somehow is irrelevant to that?
No, it's just not all perceptions. Like some perceptions are wrong, some perceptions are right. So but saying they have a perception about characters in a movie is obviously has no basis on morality. Like everyone in ethics and philosophy would agree, like, yeah, that's totally irrelevant. Like there's no immoral there at all.
So you're saying everyone in ethics and philosophy, when they're watching Star Wars, none of them would say Palpatine shouldn't have done that?
Well, they all recognize the difference between moral ontology and the perception of the emotions related to the movie, that they don't have anything there. So there's an obvious distinction there, that nothing in the movie, what they say or do, is irrelevant to morality at all because there's no conscious agents there.
Except in the script, they are conscious agents.
The script is irrelevant. So every moral philosopher just agrees on this. Like, no, they don't care what happens in the script. If there aren't any conscious agents, it's irrelevant to morality. It's just a bunch of rocks, essentially.
Right. Okay. So what I'm hearing from you is that even though it is our perception that people ought not kill babies, and it is our perception that Vader ought not to have blown up Alderaan, that the one perception is correct in your view, and the other perception is incorrect in your view.
There is no perception that Vader shouldn't blow up Alderaan because neither of those things exist. Like as far as I know, no one thinks those things exist. So they're only thinking in the context of the story.
In the context.
Yeah, but in the context of the story isn't reality. So there's a difference there, an obvious difference.
It is in our context. It's a different context than our context.
That's
but
fine.
It is reality for them. If Luke said to Leia,
no, there is no reality for them. There is no reality for them. They don't exist.
Okay, again, again, in our context, they don't exist. In their own context, there is a reality. If Luke said
No,
the
no,
Leia
no.
Vader does not exist, you would think that
in
Luke
the
would
context of reality, they don't exist. And we're talking about ontology.
In our context, they don't exist.
Doesn't make a difference. In the context of reality, they don't exist, and that's the only context that matters when we're talking about ontology, because ontology is the study of that which exists.
Okay, well, under that rubric, then in my view, God is the only thing that is real.
Okay. But you can do that, that's fine, but that then means morality is arbitrary.
Except it doesn't mean morality is arbitrary to us. Morality is dictated to us by something that is objectively real. So now you brought up the Euthyphro dilemma as though that was a problem from my view. How do you see that as a problem from my view?
If morality is determined because God says so, then morality is arbitrary. And if God says something is moral not because it's his say so, but based off of some other standard, then morality is objective, but you don't need the God. So if morality is contingent on a conscious being, it is by definition subjective. That's what subjective means. And if it's determined by something else and God is just saying it's morality because it's determined by that other thing, then you don't need the God.
So in that first
Horn?
What was that?
First horn of the dilemma?
First horn, thank you, yes. In that first horn of the dilemma, you said that it's subjective by definition. Let me just grant that. How is that relevant? How does that matter? With respect to us, it's not subjective. It's not subjective to my will or my desires. It's not subjective to yours or to Hitler's. So it doesn't seem like it's problematic for us to talk about it as a transcendent truth that transcends all human beings, and that is not subjective to societies or to individual human beings, but rather imposed upon us, something that we intuit through this divine revelation process that you seem to also recognize in your own worldview.
Well, the word subjective is contrasted to the word objective. So if it's subjective morality, then it's not objective morality. So if morality is grounded in a God, then it's subjective morality. It's not objective morality. And what we're interested in is there an objective morality? I think there is. And what you seem to be saying is it's just subjective to God, and you have a subjective morality. Transcendent to us, but it's still subjective morality.
Okay, but how is that a logical problem? I mean, let me grant that the word objective and the word subjective cannot coexist and describe the same thing. That's the way that you're using them, and I understand that. But why is that a problem?
Well,
there are still moral rules that govern all human beings at all times and in all places. You can say that that's subjective, but it's still what we experience. It's still it fits your description of what you experience with moral intuition and so forth. So how is it a logical problem?
Well, it's not a logical problem. It's totally possible that morality could be subjective. Many people hold the view that it is. It's just it wouldn't be objective morality. So the only contradiction there would be to say that morality is determined by God and it's objective. That would be a logical contradiction. If you just want to say morality is determined by God and it's subjective, that's perfectly fine. There's no logical contradiction there at all. But I believe there is an objective morality, and so that statement would be false from my perspective.
Okay, so the Euthyphro dilemma would not really be, in your mind, a problem from my view. It would just not match the combination of your view and my view.
Maybe, I'm not sure. So I would just say that the Euthyphro dilemma shows that a God-based morality can't be objective. That's what it shows.
Okay, which doesn't matter in the slightest as far as I'm aware, unless you can demonstrate that it does matter somehow.
Most theists usually argue there is objective morality, like the
sure,
moral
but
argument.
What they generally mean by that is not what you mean by the word objective. What they generally mean is that it transcends humans. In other words, it's not subjective to humans. It's objective with respect to humans, but it's not objective with respect to God.
I don't believe so. Like mostly in moral philosophy, that isn't usually what they mean by objective. Just because there's lots of things that could transcend humans and still be subjective. Like there could just be other aliens with other conscious minds and perspectives. Their opinion would transcend humans, but it wouldn't be objective. It would just be subjective to them. Or there could be supernatural beings of some kind, angels and demons or whatever, and they could have opinions, and those would transcend humans because they're not tied into humans anyway, but they wouldn't be objective either. So as far as I know, in moral philosophy, objective means not tied into a mind subjectively. But that would be, I don't understand exactly what your point is there, because it seems like anything that transcends human minds would be objective by that definition, which could include other minds that aren't human.
So my personal experience, and you have probably tons more experience talking with philosophically minded Christians than I do. But my personal experience in talking with various pastors and some philosophically minded Christians and so forth is that when they talk about objective moral values, the objective really only applies to whether or not it's subjective to us. It's not subjective to us, and therefore it's objective with respect to us. Sometimes some Christians do mean it's objective with respect to God, and others don't. But in my view, it's not objective with respect to God. It's subjective with respect to God. If we're taking subjective to mean sort of a personal opinion kind of an idea.
Okay, so based on that definition, if there are aliens and they have opinions, are those objective to humans too?
So again, in my view, the relationship of us to God is like that of Luke Skywalker to George Lucas or Tom Sawyer to Mark Twain. The relationship of us to aliens would be more like that of Luke Skywalker to Chewbacca. So
Right, but I mean,
it wouldn't be objective. It would be subjective with respect to, the alien has his personal opinion. I have my personal opinion. He doesn't ontologically govern me like Yahweh does, or like George Lucas does to Luke Skywalker.
But again, your definition was anything that transcends humanity is objective to humanity. So if there's something that transcends us, like aliens' thoughts, those are
right. Those wouldn't
transcend.
Those would simply be distinct from.
Okay, so what do you mean by transcend?
Okay, yeah, no, that's a great question. I guess I mean something with ontological authority over us, something that is above and with some kind of power over us, some kind of genuine authority, legitimate ontological authority over us. I don't know if I'm using those words quite right. I think that I am, but anyway, does that kind of clarify why an alien would not count, but a God would, or at least my God would?
Well, not necessarily, because you haven't defined what it means to have ontological authority, because that seems to be kind of arbitrary. There doesn't seem to be any such real property in reality as far as we can tell.
I've provided an analogy, the analogy of an author. So Tom Sawyer is whatever Mark Twain wants him to be. And in that sense, Mark Twain has ontological authority over Tom Sawyer. He just is whatever he makes him. And in that sense, I see that God has ontological authority over us, that we genuinely ought to obey him when he says we ought to obey him, because that's what he says. And we are what he wants us to be. So in that sense, there's this authority of being. Our being is dependent entirely upon his will, whereas our being is not dependent upon an alien's will. Our rules are not dependent on an alien's will. Like we could hypothetically construct some scenario in which aliens take over the world and they'll kill us if we don't obey them. But even so, to say that we ought to obey them is more of a circumstantial statement rather than a transcendent, this is an ought that is part of nature kind of a statement. Does that make some kind of sense of what I'm trying to say, at least?
Sure. Let's go with that description. So if, as far as I can tell, the reason George Lucas has authority over the characters in the story is because they have no will or free will in the religious context. And if they did, then he would no longer have authority. So if we assume that George Lucas's characters came to life and had will and free will, is it your position that him mass murdering them and torturing them would not be immoral?
It's my position that in terms of free will, we don't have free will. And in terms of created will, we have created will just like George Lucas's characters have created will. Like we could say that Vader wanted to kill Palpatine when he finally did. He had a will. He had a will to kill Palpatine. It's a created will. It was what George Lucas made it. Or, the people who made the Star Wars movies. I'm imputing all of that to George Lucas, which is probably not correct, but just for the sake of argument. And so likewise, our wills are just whatever God causes them to be.
Okay, so I can experience a will. I have experience. I have quality experience. And so that's what I'm defining as will here. So if the characters actually had that, not just make-believe interpretation of God, if they actually had a will, and by your definition, that will would then be caused by George Lucas, like in the God causes our will. So George Lucas would have to be able to create this will and give it to the characters. Then if he did that, it would make it okay for him to mass murder them by your definition. It would not be immoral. Is that correct?
Well, I would object to the word murder, since murder is the immoral killing of humans. So, but I would agree that killing them, George Lucas has given them will. He has given them, what was the term that you used?
Qualia?
Quality experience of will? Is that what you said?
Qualia, yeah, qualia, the philosophical term for conscious experience.
Qualia. Okay, I've never heard that word before. So conscious experience of will. Can you kind of flesh out what you mean by conscious experience of will?
Whatever we're experiencing at any given time, like literally the sense experience we have, any thoughts we have, any direct experience is qualia, essentially.
So in the universe is created by various different authors. All of the characters have that.
No, because none of them have experience. They're written to act as if they have experience, but none of them actually have experience.
I guess from my perspective, it's a distinction without a difference. We're written to have experience, so to speak. They're written to have experience, so to speak. It's the same kind of thing. I'm not sure what the difference is in your mind.
Well, I mean, I definitely can experience things, and as far as I know, Luke Skywalker can't experience anything because he literally doesn't have any experience. He has no qualia experience. He was written to as if he has experience, but I don't. I actually experience my experience, so I'm not just written as if I have experience. I actually do have experience. It's a thing. It is an existing quality that I have that Luke Skywalker doesn't have. Now, he's written as if he has it, but he doesn't actually have it.
I understand that in your mind there's a distinction there. I'm still not really catching what the distinction is. In my mind, our experiences are simply what God wants them to be. He determines all of them.
So
And
like if there's a difference between George Lucas writing the character Luke Skywalker and George Lucas writing the character with Luke Skywalker and giving him a consciousness as an additional feature of that being. So like, imagine I create a video game. I'm George Lucas and I create a video game and I write all of the characters in the story as just computer players. They have no consciousness. They're just programming, acting out in accordance with no consciousness at all. But then I add in a different character, which is Luke Skywalker, who has a will, who has consciousness. He exists. That is a different property. There's a difference between those two things. In philosophy, it's the philosophical zombie versus the conscious agent distinction. You can write all characters like philosophical zombies that have no consciousness, and they're just rocks essentially interacting. Or you can write characters and give them consciousness. And there's a distinction between those two things, which is consciousness. Consciousness exists in one and it doesn't exist in the other. Does that make sense?
Not really. I don't think that George Lucas wrote Luke Skywalker to be a rock. I'm not really sure what you mean by that. Luke Skywalker has consciousness in the context of the Star Wars universe. Tom Sawyer has consciousness in the context of his universe, and we have consciousness in the context of our universe. And to me, it seems like it's a corresponding concept there.
Well, so like you're familiar with video games, correct?
Familiar. I really don't play them at all ever. So
have you seen?
But I know what video games are. So
have you seen the movie The Matrix? The Neo.
Yeah.
So
at least saw the first one, but it was a while ago.
Yeah. So in the Matrix, you can go into the Matrix, and there are these two people. One of them is a computer-generated ones and zeros with no consciousness, and one of them is another person who's in the room next to you, also in the computer. Do you see a difference between those two things?
Yeah. So the person who is in the Matrix but is not of the Matrix. So you've got your non-player character and you've got your player character. I do see a difference between those things. The player character is not invented by the inventor of the video game. The player character is a separate thing from the video game, and that's obviously not what I believe in. I don't believe that we somehow exist next to God, and then God like writes us as biographies into this narrative that He created. We are the non-player characters. Now Jesus would be a player character because he's actually the author.
Well, I don't see
wrote himself into the plot.
I'm not sure I understand your point there, because it doesn't seem to matter who made them. Like, for example, if I'm the author of The Matrix and also made this other person independently of The Matrix and then put them in like a whatever the headset thingy is, and then they're in The Matrix, and so I created both the artificial person with no consciousness that's just a bunch of ones and zeros, and I created the thing with consciousness in The Matrix, and they're both right next to each other, but there is a difference.
Sure. To me, that would be like if Luke Skywalker wrote a book. That would mean that George Lucas wrote a book inside of the book that he wrote. And then the characters that Luke Skywalker wrote would be also characters that George Lucas wrote, but there would be a total difference between Luke Skywalker and Luke Skywalker's characters in George Lucas's Star Wars universe.
What would be the difference? Because I don't see any difference between the characters so George Lucas writes Luke into a story, and he writes that Luke writes a story. So ontologically, there's no difference between Luke's characters and Luke. They are the same.
Well, I would agree that in our context, they're all fictional, but in Luke Skywalker's context, only one of them is fictional, and it's not Luke Skywalker.
Again, I'm not sure I see a difference. Ontologically, all of the features that they have are equivalent. They're all made of the exact same stuff. There isn't a property that Luke has that Luke's characters don't have.
In Luke Skywalker's universe, there is. It's called being real. In Luke Skywalker's universe, Luke is real, and he can talk to Leia, and Leia will say, yes, you're real. And then Luke Skywalker will show him his book of fiction, Dick and Jane or whatever, and say, look, Dick is not real. And Leia will say, you're right, Dick is not real, but you are real, Luke. And so inside the Luke Skywalker universe, Luke is real, Leia is real, Darth is real. But outside of that universe, they may not be. They aren't in ours.
Okay, but that doesn't change any of their properties. That's just the context changes the perspective of the properties, but the properties don't actually change regardless of the context. So the properties are still the same in all of them. You're just describing it with different contexts or perspectives. I don't see how that changes. Luke and all of his characters are still exactly the same. They have exactly the same properties, even though from Luke's perspective they have different properties.
So let's say that I grant that. If I understand what you're saying, then I grant that. But that would simply mean that we have consciousness, Luke has consciousness, and Luke's characters that Luke creates have consciousness. So how does that affect our conversation?
Well, from my perspective, I would say we do have consciousness because it's a thing. Like consciousness is an actual real thing. It's like having a brain. It's a thing. And Luke does not have a brain. But Luke does not have consciousness, essentially.
In the context of the Star Wars universe, he does have a brain.
Again, the context doesn't change the facts of the matter. The facts of the matter stay the same. The context only changes the perspective of the facts. So the context doesn't actually change anything.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you is that if Luke Skywalker told Princess Leia that Darth Vader doesn't exist, he would be speaking accurately. And you would be like, yeah, right on, Luke. You wouldn't be like, why is he saying that? That's weird.
Yes.
And I don't think that that's the case. I think you would be like, why is he saying that? That's weird. Is he lying to her? Does he not realize that Darth Vader is a real person? Because in their context, Darth Vader is.
Right, but again, in their context doesn't make a difference to the facts. The properties aren't changed based on context. Context can't change the properties. The properties are the only thing that matters here. There are no difference in properties between Luke and his characters, regardless of the perspective of anybody. Perspective doesn't make a difference. Because again, the perspective is that whole subjective thing that doesn't make a difference. They objectively have the same properties. There's not a property you can list that Luke has that his characters don't have. Whereas there is one I can list that I have that Luke Skywalker doesn't have, which is consciousness. Consciousness is a thing. It exists. It's real.
Well, consciousness is a thing that's been written into your character in our context by God. It's also a thing that's been written into Luke's context by George Lucas. So insofar as you have it, in a very similar way, Luke Skywalker has it. If Luke Skywalker doesn't have it because he's fictional, then you also don't have it because you're fictional. It's something that is just, you could say perhaps artificial intelligence, because God is really the only intelligence. Yours is simply derived. It's pretend. It's based upon his. His is the real intelligence. That would be my perspective. So I'm not really seeing. I don't know. I guess I don't know where this conversation is going at this point.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting.
Clearly, we disagree. We can agree that we disagree.
Well, I think it's a really interesting conversation because I've never heard this perspective before, so I like thinking through it. But would you say there's a difference between writing a robot and building a robot?
Writing. Okay, so you mean like I make a story that has a robot in it versus I build a robot that can go and get me some coffee.
Or just writing the plans of a robot and then actually building the robot.
Okay. Yes, I would say that there's a difference.
What's the difference?
The difference is that one exists in a sense next to me, whereas the other one exists in a sense in my imagination. I guess if I wrote the plans in a physical way on paper, then they would exist next to me.
Right, that's what I'm asking about. I'm asking about the physical writing of the characters on paper versus the physical robot. What's the difference between those two things?
Well, the physical robot would be assembled from parts that exist next to me in the same ontological context in which I exist. The paper also would exist in the same ontological context in which I exist, but the concept depicted on the paper would not. That would exist. It would be a mental construct that I'm trying to communicate either to my future self or to someone else, perhaps.
Okay, let me ask you this way. Is there a difference between rocks in God's mind and people in God's mind?
And you mean in terms of ontology?
Yeah, I think maybe.
I don't know if I'm using the word right. Rocks in God's mind and people in God's mind. Well, apart from it would be the same kind of a difference that there would be for rocks in your mind versus people in your mind. If you imagine a fictional person and you imagine a fictional rock, obviously the rock is not a person even in your head, and the person is not a rock even in your head, but they're both imaginary in your head. So they have sort of the same ontological existence, so to speak. They both exist only in your head. But nonetheless, the rock is not the person is not the rock. There's a difference between a person and a rock.
Okay, let me ask this way. Do you think consciousness is real? Is there such a thing as consciousness?
I think that God is conscious of his desires. So I think probably that answer, that's a yes answer to your question.
Okay, I mean, it's like specifically for humans, is human consciousness a real thing, or is it completely imaginary, doesn't exist at all? Like for example, we don't exist. Like there is no me. I don't exist. There's no consciousness there. It's just God's imagination, essentially. There is no me.
So if you want to call God's imagination non-existent, or if you want to say the things in God's imagination do not exist in God's reality, I would agree. We do not exist in God's reality, in the authorial reality, just like Luke Skywalker doesn't exist in George Lucas's reality. We don't exist in God's reality. God is the only real thing. God is existence.
Okay, but I'm asking like more specifically, does the consciousness that exists in God's imagination, is it a thing that exists in God's imagination? Or is it purely a fabrication in God's imagination? Like, for example, in a video game, there can be real things that exist in the video game, and there can be fake things that exist in the video game. And there's a difference between those. Like, for example...
give me an example. That'd be helpful.
So like if you're looking at a computer screen and you're looking at a window next to it, and the computer screen is like, if you take a picture outside and you put half the picture on your computer screen and half is just, you're just looking through the window, they seem the exact same, but one of them is there and one of them is just a fabrication on the computer screen.
Okay, so I've got my computer next to a window, and I take a picture, and inside the picture is the computer screen, and also.
I mean, just like if you take a picture of the background, like a mountain or something, and then you're looking at the mountain through the window, and you put a computer screen up, and it covers like half of the mountain, and you just put the picture on the background of the computer screen. You're looking at the computer screen and the mountain, but they both look the exact same. They're both just seeing the mountain.
I'm having trouble following your scenario.
So it's just, if like, you can put pictures on your background screen, and if you just put a picture on your background screen that looks exactly like what's behind your screen, it looks like your screen isn't there. Okay. So I'm looking at my computer and I'm seeing my desk behind it because that's what my background is.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm with you so far. So what about this now?
So there's a difference between the thing we're seeing on the right-hand side, which is the actual desk, and the thing we're seeing on the left-hand side, which is a screen with the picture of the desk.
Okay. Yeah.
And so my question is that the same for people? Like, are people like a real thing, or are they only just like, I don't know how to phrase this. So.
Okay. So in my view, in order for people to be what you're calling real, we would have to exist next to God in some sort of real sense. Like we would be in his context. It would be like as though Luke Skywalker were a real person, and George Lucas decided to make this Star Wars narrative and put this real person, Luke Skywalker, into it. But that's not what happened. Luke Skywalker is just purely George Lucas's imagination, and we are purely God's imagination. It's not like we exist next to him and he's now placing us into his narrative. We're part of his narrative. We're just made up.
So does God exist in reality?
Yes.
Does Luke Skywalker exist in reality?
It depends on what you mean by reality. If you mean God's reality.
No. There's no subjective. There's only one reality. There's only one reality. There isn't a kind of reality.
I don't know that I agree with you on that point. I mean, what do you mean by reality? If what you mean is there's only one reality, then only God exists. And we don't, and Luke Skywalker doesn't exist.
Okay, so that's an interesting perspective. So from my perspective, there is only one reality. Reality is all that which exists. So I exist, I'm a part of reality, God exists, God is a part of reality, if God exists. But there isn't a subset. Like Luke Skywalker doesn't
So you're saying
exist.
there is no such thing as fiction. Fiction doesn't exist.
Yeah, that's what fiction means. It doesn't exist. So
Actually, it's
yes,
not what fiction means. It means that it's made up.
which means it doesn't exist. Those are the same thing.
Okay, so you're saying nobody ever makes anything up.
Well, no. Making things up means it doesn't exist in reality.
It doesn't exist outside of the made-up context. Right. It only exists in the made-up context. That would be fiction.
Well, the made-up context isn't relevant. It's just the reality thing. So fictional means not in reality. So it seems like your argument you're making, you're branched reality into different kinds of reality, and you're saying that there's the God's reality and then there's another reality. And that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because it seems that we also exist in God's reality, like necessarily. Because if God exists and we're a part of his mind, then we exist as a part of in God's reality. Because
Okay,
we're things like there's
you're defining fiction as something that's real. You've taken my construct in which we're merely God's imagination, and you've said if we're God's imagination, then we're real. And yet you define imagination as something not real. I'm not quite following what you're saying.
all right. So I'm saying I have consciousness. That is a thing in reality, the most fundamental part of reality. That can't be a fabrication or a fiction or a story. Consciousness cannot be a fiction. It could be made of other things, like it could be a result of another mind or something. That's definitely possible, but it cannot be not reality. It has to be a part of reality, and not in a fictional sense. It has to be a part of the most fundamental part of reality. And so if you're saying that consciousness isn't a part of the most fundamental reality and it's a subset of some other reality, that doesn't make any sense, because that can't be the case. We know that consciousness must be a part of the fundamental nature of reality. It's the cogito ergo sum argument. That's the only thing we can know with absolute certainty is fundamental more than anything else is consciousness. So, but it seems your argument is taking that and saying, oh, nope, consciousness is just kind of a subset of a different reality.
If consciousness is the fundamental nature of reality, then how is it that you claim to be an atheist? I'm confused.
No. So we know consciousness is a part of the fundamental nature of reality. It may not be the absolute everything. We know consciousness is a part of the fundamental nature of reality. It can't be a subset of some other reality. That it can't be.
Okay, so you're saying that there's no sense in which Luke Skywalker is conscious, and if George Lucas wrote a book, or Mark Twain wrote a book, in which Tom Sawyer, the narrative says, Tom Sawyer resumed consciousness as he woke up from his nap, you would say that this doesn't make any sense. This is just it's an incoherent statement. It's like talking about the smell of the color 7. It's just totally meaningless. Tom Sawyer can't have consciousness. You wouldn't be able to understand the book when it says that Tom Sawyer has consciousness. It wouldn't have any meaning.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that consciousness, as I experience it, if you tried to write me into a book, it would fail 100% of the time. You can't do it. You can't write my consciousness into a book. My consciousness is a part of the fundamental nature of reality. You can't fiction it into existence. It exists. It is a part of the fundamental reality. That's just what consciousness, that's the cogito ergo sum argument. We know whatever my consciousness is, and whatever your consciousness is, if you experience it, presumably you're not a philosophical zombie either. So whatever our consciousness is, it is a part of the fundamental nature of reality. You can't make it not that. It is necessarily a part of the most fundamental nature of reality. And it seems like what you're arguing is, well, no, it's not. There is a something else that makes it up. That consciousness is a fiction, a result of something else, and it's not a part of the fundamental nature of reality. And that seems to fly in the face of the most well-renowned philosophical arguments ever, the cogito ergo sum. That's where I would see a problem with your argument.
I guess I'm not really following. You don't seem to have a problem with Tom Sawyer having consciousness, and you don't seem to even have a problem if God exists with God having consciousness, and yet you have a problem with the idea that we are like Tom Sawyer and that we could possibly have consciousness like Tom Sawyer. And you also have a problem personally with the idea that consciousness is the foundational nature of reality, like I believe that it is. God's consciousness is the foundational nature of reality, and yet again, you're acting as though it is. You're acting as though not only is consciousness the foundational or part of the foundational nature of reality, but also that it cannot be fiction, which would indicate, first of all, I mean, I feel like I'm getting all these conflicting messages from you. Like Tom Sawyer being conscious wouldn't
Right.
have any meaning, couldn't possibly have any meaning if consciousness by definition has to be part of the foundational nature of reality, and Tom Sawyer cannot possibly be real. And yet it would have meaning. You'd read that and you'd totally understand what's
Well,
being said.
again, have meaning isn't relevant here. It's have meaning in the context of reality. If it has meaning in a fictional context and it's fictional, that's perfectly fine. But it can't ever, the statement Tom Sawyer has consciousness can't ever have meaning in the fundamental nature of reality. The statement I have consciousness does have meaning in the fundamental nature of reality, regardless of whether there's a God or not. So if there's a God and I said TJump is conscious, that statement does have meaning in the fundamental nature of reality. If we said Tom Sawyer has consciousness, that statement does not have meaning in the fundamental nature of reality, regardless of what the author does. So the difference there is that we know that consciousness, whatever it is, the cogito ergo sum, is a part of the fundamental nature of reality. Now, and by that, it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about what it's made of. It could be idealism, where everything is fundamentally conscious. It could be dualism, where it's part conscious, part physical, or it could be materialism, where it's all material. But we know that whatever that consciousness is a part of the fundamental nature of reality. It can't be a fiction, not an option. So it's like Tom Sawyer having consciousness, that is a fiction. We know that's a fiction. It can't be, well, it could be the case that we can actually impart consciousness on created beings. It's possible. But as far as we know, it's not the case. So Tom Sawyer has consciousness does not have meaning in the reality. Does not. That statement does not ever have meaning in reality. It can have meaning fictionally, but it doesn't ever have meaning in reality. Whereas the statement TJump exists does have meaning in reality, regardless of whether or not you think God is a subset of that or not. Or we are a subset of God.
So I feel like in the language that you're using, the way that you're using words, you're using the word reality to equate to the word that I'm using, our context, or the term that I'm calling our context. You're calling it reality. And then you would agree that there's a different something in which Tom Sawyer could be said to exist in some sort of meaningful way. There's a different something in which Luke Skywalker could be said to exist in some sort of meaningful way. But they're not what you would call part of reality, what I would call part of our context. So I think that your word reality and my word or my phrase our context are synonyms here. But I would use the word reality in my language to refer to God's context. And our context then would be to God the same way that Tom Sawyer's context would be to us.
That's where that's where I'm seeing the problem here, because I can't exist fictionally in God's context. That's not possible.
Why?
Because reality supersedes God. Reality is above God.
Okay, you're saying our context is above God's context.
No, I mean, like, God has to exist in reality. If God doesn't exist in reality, then he doesn't exist. So, like, God is a thing in reality. Reality is the collection of all things that exist, like, not fictionally. And so God is in that list if he exists. And I am also in that list. I can't be a fiction of God.
That you're in that list?
Because I experience it. I have quality experience, consciousness, cogito ergo sum. That's
sure, but in the Tom Sawyer narratives, Tom Sawyer does as well.
No, that's false. That's the problem, is that he doesn't. In the context of reality, that statement does not work. There is no meaning.
In your context, it doesn't work, but in his context, it does work.
Well, no, it doesn't work at all.
If it doesn't work at all, then the whole narrative is meaningless. I mean, how are you able to watch movies? How are you able to take in a story or read a book if it doesn't make any sense, like you're saying it doesn't?
Because it doesn't make any sense in the context of reality.
In our context, sure.
The only context that exists.
Context, but everything else sense in its own context.
Yes, that's true. It makes sense in its own context, which doesn't exist
in our context, except as a fiction.
No, because there's the reality and there's not reality. The contexts here don't make a difference.
Well, so, I hear you asserting these things. I don't hear any justification for them, but maybe you can justify them. I'm just not picking up on what it is.
Maybe, yes. I think it's interesting. I'm not sure how one would go about what kind of justification would be required for that. So, for example, cogito ergo sum is considered to be like the strongest argument in all of philosophy ever. I think, therefore I am. I exist.
Okay, so that seems to presuppose that. Hang on here. That seems to presuppose that one concept, in this case, I think, can imply another concept. In this case, I am. But concepts don't have to behave the way that you want them to. It doesn't have to be the case that one concept can or does imply another.
Right. Those aren't two separate contexts. Those are the same thing. So I think, the thinking is me. So it's just tautology. It's like saying I'm unmarried, therefore I'm a bachelor.
Okay, but again, in our context, what would justify the claim that tautologies are true or that contradictions are false?
I think therefore I am. The fact that we exist and we exist in reality, and then logic describes reality, and from that we can get standard logic.
Okay, so again, you're finding implications here. You're finding that one concept can imply another concept, but why would you think that they do? What would
Because
justify that thought?
it describes reality. That's why.
Well, you think that it describes reality, but why would you think that it describes reality?
Because I exist. And since I exist, there must be a reality, and then we can try to different languages, like A does not equal A, to describe reality. Those don't work, and we can try for some that do, and they do describe reality.
You're
And
again
get,
presupposing implication here, that the one idea can imply another.
but no,
And
the ideas are irrelevant here. There is a reality. I exist, and then we can use that to create languages, and the languages can describe reality or not describe reality. The implications.
Sure, you're saying all of that, and I'm not saying that I disagree with you. I'm just saying that all of those words are statements that, whether I agree with them or not, seem to be totally unjustified unless you are the creator of reality.
No, again, that's irrelevant. So I exist. That's all I need. I don't need anything else. That justifies all logic and all math, and that's done. I don't need to presuppose anything. I don't need to
only if you presuppose implication, only if you presuppose deduction, only if you presuppose
don't need to presuppose any of that. I can just say those are all languages.
Identity. Why are you presupposing all of these things? What justifies those?
I don't need to presuppose any of those things. Those are all descriptive.
And you can't come to any conclusions. Conclusions are based on all of
those are all just, again, descriptive. So I can come on to conclusions. They're all descriptive. That's fine. You don't need to presuppose them. So I don't presuppose any of that. I exist. And then from that, I can create a language to describe this existence. Language I don't presuppose. I'm just creating a language to describe the things that I exist, the thinking. And that's it. I don't presuppose anything.
Logic, so there are no therefores in your world?
No, there are therefores, but again, I'm creating that as a language based off of the fact I exist. It's not a presupposition. It's a posteriori. I exist, I have experiences, and I'm using language to describe those things. So it's not a priori. It's not a presupposition. I'm not presupposing these things. I'm using them as a language to describe this. Does that make sense? The difference between a presupposition, which is something you start with as true before making the argument, versus a constructed language, which is something that you make up to describe the thing?
I think so, but even in your descriptions, you're describing conclusions that result from implications that result from premises. Now, even if we could grant that the premise "I exist" is justified, or I think is justified, it still doesn't follow that any of the conclusions that you draw from that are. Unless,
that's exactly true. That's exactly true. We don't have absolute certainty on any of that. All of that is post hoc. You're right. That's totally fine. There's no problem with that.
Yeah, I'm not arguing about absolute certainty. I'm arguing about rational justification.
Right, yeah, rational justification does follow simply from I think, therefore I am. You don't need absolute certainty to have rational justification. Just the fact that the language can work to describe the experience of I think is sufficient.
So when you dream, you exist in your dream.
Yes.
And all of the ideas in your dream seem to be, based upon your logic, just as justified as all of the ideas outside of your dream.
Sure.
Okay, so you're saying that in terms of rationality, there's no distinction between the two. Is that correct? Neither is a conclusion inside of a dream, which doesn't exist in reality according to you, is just as warranted as a conclusion, just as justified rationally as a conclusion outside of a dream, which is reflective of reality.
Yes and no. So there's certain kinds of conclusion, like I can say, I see a unicorn. Now in a dream, that's completely justified because you are seeing a unicorn. If you say, I see a unicorn which exists in reality, that statement would not be justified in the dream because the unicorn doesn't exist in reality. So it depends on the kind of proposition you're making. If you're making a proposition about reality itself and you're justifying it based off of a dream, then it wouldn't be justified. But if you're making a proposition about like a reflective proposition, I see a unicorn, or I think this, or I feel this, or whatever, then that's perfectly reasonable, even if it's in a dream. So like if I'm dreaming and I say, I see Luke Skywalker, that's perfectly reasonable. If I say, I see a real existing Luke Skywalker that exists in reality, that would not be reasonable.
But when you say, I see Luke Skywalker versus I see a real Luke Skywalker that exists in reality, it seems to me that those two statements are actually synonyms. Or identical statements?
Well, no, because one carries a much heavier burden of proof. Like if I said, I see Luke Skywalker, and the only thing I mean by that is that I have some sense experience which correlates to what I consider to be Luke Skywalker, and I don't say anything about whether or not it exists, then it's a much simpler statement to prove than if I
Okay, so it's
actually.
more of a philosophical statement rather than the way that a person would normally talk. Because I mean, normally if I say, "Oh, I see a cat," what I'm saying is there is a real cat over there that I observe, and so on and so forth. And you're taking "I see a cat" to not necessarily mean that, rather to just mean there's a sensory experience that I'm trying to describe.
Right. Yeah, I'm taking it in the philosophical context. It's kind of I'm a philosopher. It's what I do. So yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between those two statements. Is one is that in a dream, the statements "I see Luke Skywalker" is equally as justified as when I say "I see Luke Skywalker now." There's no difference between those two things because we don't have any way to prove that what we're experiencing now is real. There's no absolute certainty. But in the dream, I can be justified in that conclusion to believe that it's reality if there is no defeater for it. Essentially, it's called fallibilism. So yes, you can still get rational justification in a dream for certain beliefs, and if everything is a dream and you can't tell the difference, then you can still be rationally justified in believing it's reality, even if you're wrong. But yeah, it's yes, essentially yes, you can be justified in believing things about reality in a dream. It is possible.
So from my perspective, when I talk with people and observe folks and so forth, it seems to me that people don't believe that claims are rationally justified unless they can be traced back to will or desire. And maybe I'm totally off base here, but this appears to be.
Do you mean moral claims or just any claims?
Any claims. So a person makes a claim, then unless they can if a person says "I think," then what is the warrant for that claim? The fact that it cannot be false, because that would be.
Well, yeah, it could definitely be false because they could just not exist and just have the words like on a screen or something. But it would be the experience, like the quality experience, is why it would be true.
Right, but a lunatic has experience, and we don't consider the lunatic's beliefs rational. So what makes the claim "I think" rational?
Because you can't say "I think" and be wrong. You can't think and not think at the same time.
Well, that's presupposing non-contradiction, isn't it?
Nope, that's just describing. That's creating a language and then using the language to describe the fact that you exist. You don't presuppose it. Like I'm not presupposing English right now because we're using English. I'm just using English because it's what I know. You don't actually need English. You could use other languages.
But you're saying it can't be wrong. Why can't something both be right and wrong at the same time and in the same way?
Because it isn't describing reality, what reality means.
But I mean, why would you think that reality means that? What would draw you? What would cause you to come to that conclusion? The contradictions are always false.
Well, contradictions aren't always false. There are quantum mechanics. But this just, again, the point of "I think, therefore I am" leads to "I exist in reality." And then we create a language called logic, which describes the reality. And one of the things that we can use to describe it is A equals A. So we can say, "I exist, but I don't not exist at the same time because I'm currently existing." And
So I guess what I'm hearing from you is that you believe that if something is, then it is, and you can't justify that. And you believe that if something is, it can't not be at the same time and in the same way, unless we're talking quantum mechanics.
Well, no, I do justify it. So
that either.
So I exist. I mean, I think, therefore I am, and I am me. That's A equals A. So it's not a presupposition there. I'm just describing the fact that I exist.
You're describing it based upon your own personal understanding, just like a lunatic would describe the things that he sees based on his own personal understanding. But his claims are not rational. And you're saying that your claims have the same amount of rationality that his do.
In that one, yes. Because in that one, you can't not exist. That whatever it's saying is reflective. It's like saying, "I see a unicorn."
You're saying it can't not exist, but what would justify that claim?
The fact that I'm saying it or experiencing it. So again, like if I said, "I see a unicorn," that the burden of that one is very small because it doesn't entail that the unicorn exists. So if I'm saying that I see my experience, that is, again, the burden of that one is pretty small because all you have to do to meet it is to actually experience something. And so any lunatic who says that is going to be true because the burden of proof is so small for that claim. It's reflective.
Okay, so you're thinking that if you seem to be assuming that if a claim is reflective, then it's justified. And I'm not sure what justifies that claim that something that is reflective is justified.
Well, it's like saying that is a tree. And the word tree is irrelevant. Like I'm using that word to describe something that I see. And so that alone justifies the use of the word tree. I'm going to choose tree over other words. I can use whatever
So
tree.
you've chosen these things. It all comes down to your will. You want it to be tree is this thing. And it just, because it's tree, by your own definition, it's tree.
Well, no, it's the language I'm using, the A equals A logic, that I'm choosing. You could choose other logics. You could use non-standard logic, use some many-valued logics, quantum logics, intuitionistic logics. You don't need to use A equals A logic. It's just a language like English. And so I can pick that word because I like it, as opposed to picking a different language because they like it. So the logic there, the A equals A, is just a language like English. It's the word tree. I can pick a different word if I want, but we're describing something, which is the qualia experience.
So insofar as you're picking things just because you like it, I would agree that there's no further justification necessary for the claim. But insofar as you're not merely just picking something because you like it, it seems like there needs to be more warrant for the claim.
Oh, absolutely. You're right. So if I was claiming that like A equals A applies to all statements in the universe ever at all times, no matter what, that would require a much higher burden of proof, which we don't have and don't need. It's false. We know that there are certain cases where A equals not A in quantum mechanics. So I'm not saying that A equals A applies to everything in the universe at all times, at all places. I don't need to. It's just a language to describe my experience. And there are certain cases where it's not the case, and that's totally fine.
So I'm not sure that you completely understood what I just said. Maybe you did, and it's probably my fault if you didn't. But any claim that doesn't merely proceed from your will needs further justification than merely the claim itself.
Right.
And I think doesn't merely proceed from your will.
Yeah, it does. What? I'm not sure I follow that part.
So would you think that it's true that you think, let me rephrase, the fact that you think is a fact because you want it to be a fact?
Oh, no.
Is that what you call an accurate statement?
No, I would say it's a fact independent of whether I want it to be a fact or not.
Okay, and so the basis of claiming that there are facts that are independent of whether you want them to be facts or not comes from what? What makes you think that?
Because I can not want it to exist and yet I still exist.
Right. So you see that you're not in charge of a lot of things,
Right.
right? It's not just based upon your own personal will and your own personal desire. Okay. And so now when you think about those things, those thoughts, those things that you're not in charge of, those thoughts are based upon some sort of assumptions that you didn't just come up with on your own, because you didn't come up with those things on your own.
Well, no, again, it's purely based on experience. So if I want to not exist, which I can do, I don't stop existing. So I can literally experience that and show that there's an incongruency there.
Okay, but to talk about those things in a rational sense, it seems to me that there has to be warrant for the claim, and simply
Wait,
saying.
what do you mean? What do you mean? To talk about the things, there needs to be warrant for which claim? I'm not following. Because to talk about it, all you need is a language. We can just have a language to describe the thing. I experience I exist, and I can experience I don't want to exist, and I can experience both of those things at the same time. And then I just need a language to describe those two things. And then that would justify it.
Only if a lunatic can talk about his experiences with his own language that he comes up with to describe them, but the claims that he's making would not be justified.
Well, it depends on the claim. There are actually many they can make that are justified.
If they're rational claims, then they're rationally justified. When I said a lunatic, I guess lunatics are capable of making some rational claims, sure, but I was attempting to imply that the claim that they're making is in fact not rational. So pick any non-rational claim that a lunatic makes, and it seems to be just as justified as the claims that you're claiming are justified. And I'm not really seeing what the difference is. Like, the lunatic believes the kinds of things that you're saying about things that you think are lunacy.
Well, again, it's the do the words we're using describe the things that we experience? That's the question. And I can say that the ideas I have don't describe the things I experience, and that's what it would be a lunatic. And then I would say it's rational if the things I'm saying do describe the things I'm experiencing.
What would make you think that it's even possible to describe something that you didn't will into existence?
There's a TV in front of me. It has very pretty lights. I did not will it into existence. I don't know what that means.
Okay, so the lunatic says there's a unicorn in front of me. I did not will it into existence. I can describe it.
Sure.
And you would say, okay, that's crazy. But I don't see how you've offered anything less crazy than that. You've offered a different example, an example that I would agree is not crazy. But my question is what makes the one not crazy and the other crazy?
One describes reality, one doesn't.
According to who?
Reality.
So, okay, so reality thinks, in your view?
Oh no, it's just reality is just a set of facts that are true. It doesn't think at all. So it's if our statements describe that, they're rational. If they don't describe that, they're not rational.
Okay, so you're saying that rationality and truth are identical?
Truth is a property of sentences. Rationality is trying to get the sentences to have that property.
Okay, do you believe that a claim can be rational and yet false? Do you
Yes.
believe that a claim can be true and yet not rational?
Yes. Yes to
Okay.
both.
Okay, so even if your claim that there's a TV in front of you is true and it reflects reality, that doesn't make it rational. And even
Correct.
if the lunatic's claim that there's a unicorn in front of him is false, that doesn't make it not rational or
Right.
rational.
Right.
So it doesn't seem as though your claim that there's a TV in front of you is any less rational in your view than the claim of a lunatic that there's a unicorn in front of him is yeah, it seems like they have a rational equivalence, an equivalence of no rationality at all.
Well, again,
Is
that's
perspective on your view.
prima facie. Yeah, they're exactly equivalent. Any single claim, regardless of what it is, has exactly the same rationality to it until you start applying the methodology to it to compare, does this describe reality or does it not describe reality?
But the lunatic believes that his claim does describe reality, and you believe that your claim does describe reality. And so the fact that a person believes that their claim describes reality doesn't mean that it does.
Right.
What would justify the claim that it does?
The coherentist theory of truth is what it's called. It's like, can we get the sentences we use to describe our experience, and is that coherent? And if so, then it's justified. So if the lunatic has a complete model of epistemology there that it's been able to use justifiably for a long time, and it concludes that there's a unicorn in front of it, then it would be justified in believing that.
Okay, so as long as the lunatic is not contradicting himself, his claims are not irrational. Is that your view?
Essentially, I would go further than that. I would say that we have empirical representation to actually judge rational and irrational in addition to that. But yes.
Well, he does as well. I mean, he has his empirical.
All right. The reason we
concept
think he's a lunatic
from-
is because we disagree with what he's saying, because we have other empirical data that contradicts it. If we didn't have any contradicting empirical data, we wouldn't think he was a lunatic. But yeah,
Right, but he has empirical data that contradicts your claims.
right.
Does that make you a lunatic?
No, again, we go based off of empirical data and the consensus for the most part. And so the fact that there is one person that is an outlier in the consensus of many people is why we call him a lunatic.
Well, he doesn't see himself as an outlier. He understands that the whole world agrees with him. They may all be
right. Then he may be justified in believing what he believes. That is definitely possible.
okay. So then his claims would not be irrational if there's justification for them.
Right. That's what justification means. Yes.
Okay. So what I'm hearing from you is that claims that I think probably virtually everyone on Earth would call irrational are conceivably rational, and claims that probably everybody on Earth would call rational have no more or less rational justification than those claims, because they could still be, they don't even have to measure, they don't even have to match truth. A claim can be rational or irrational without matching truth. And so your claims about the TV, it seems as though what you're saying is that your claims about the TV are no more or less rational than the lunatic's claims about the unicorn.
Well, no, again, because we have evidence for both. So again, in philosophy, there's a position called fallibilism, which is you can have a justified true belief, and if it happens to be true, then it's knowledge. If it happens to not be true, then it's not knowledge. but that doesn't mean it's not justified. It can still have justification. It's just not knowledge because it's not true. So if it's still rational to believe it, even if it's not true, because you have justification. So if like you're a lunatic and you've lived your entire life petting unicorns, and the unicorns told you the lottery number and you won the lottery or whatever, at least you perceived yourself to win the lottery, and you perceive yourself to interact with these unicorns consistently on a daily basis, then you would be justified to believe in unicorns. As long as you didn't have any like serious contradicting data, that would be justified. It would be reasonable for you to believe in unicorns if you experience them, or if you experience God every day. If you could pray to God and God talks back, that would be a good justifiable reason to believe in God. Gives novel testable predictions. But it wouldn't be true. It'd still be reasonable because you can have a belief be justified without it being true.
Okay, so again, what I think I'm hearing from you is that from your perspective, the lunatic who talks about the unicorns as though they're real is rationally justified. And I don't think that's what the rest of the world thinks when they use the term rationally justified. Maybe it is, but I don't think so. In my experience, the guy claiming that the unicorns are there would not be called rationally justified. And so for me personally, I have tried to look at what people generally consider rational in conversations that I have with them. I mean, you kind of exist in a different world than me. You know, you interact with philosophers on a daily basis and stuff, and I just talk with average people. But it seems to me that most people would think that the claims about the unicorn are not rational. The claims about the TV are. Most people, it seems to me, would think that the claims of a calculator are rational, even though the calculator can't justify its claims. The claims of a magic 8-ball are not, even if they happen to be true.
Right, and I would agree with all of that, but that's because we have empirical evidence that shows there are no unicorns, that calculators work, and that magic 8-balls don't work. We have a great deal of background knowledge that can do that. And if the psychopath had a great deal of background knowledge that those did work for some reason, then he would be justified in concluding the opposite. Like if we experienced unicorns, if unicorns existed, then we would be reasonable to justify our belief in unicorns. It would be rational to believe in unicorns if we actually had unicorns around. And so for a lunatic who doesn't know he's a lunatic and sees unicorns, it would be rational for him to conclude there are unicorns. Just for the exact same reason it's rational for us to conclude there aren't. So I mean, it would be contradiction for me to say that a lunatic's views couldn't be rational if they experienced unicorns.
So I think that, again, what I'm trying to get at is that I think that most people would claim that the claim of unicorns is irrational, and you're claiming that it's rational. And I understand why you're claiming that. I understand your construct. I think I do, at least.
Well, I
don't think it matches what people mean when they say rational, normally, at least.
Well, I think because everything I'm saying is congruent with what most people believe. So it's like the reason it's irrational to say unicorns exist is because we have no empirical evidence of unicorns. Therefore, it's not rational to say we have unicorns. What?
The lunatic thinks that he does. He thinks that he has tons of empirical evidence for unicorns. That's why he believes that there's one in front of him.
Right. So if we had lots of experience of unicorns, it would be rational to believe in unicorns, regardless of whether they're a lunatic or not. But it's the exact same methodology you're applying both ways. It seems like what you're saying entails a contradiction. You're saying, well, it's rational to believe in unicorns, but if someone didn't believe in unicorns, that would be irrational simply because it's rational to believe that there are no unicorns. Well, that's not the case.
I'm defining rationality differently than you are.
How are you defining it?
I think that the way that people use the term is not in concord with the way that you're using it. Now, that's fine. You can use the term any way you want, and other people can. And maybe I'm totally mistaken about how people use the term. But I think that when people use the term rational and irrational, they mean something significantly different than what you're talking about.
How do you define it? What do you think that means?
I think that ultimately it goes back to the will. So things don't have to behave the way that you want them to behave. The only thing that does is that thing that has to behave the way that you want it to behave, the thing that is the product of your will. So even as this is, I apologize, this is difficult for me to explain, even from my perspective. So if I can't communicate it to you, it's no doubt on my end is the problem of communication here. One way of looking at it is to say that, okay, let me give some examples here. Going back to the calculator and the magic 8-ball, even if the magic 8-ball were right, its claims would be irrational in most people's minds, I think. The calculator, on the other hand, its claims are rational. Now, it's not because the calculator can justify its claims on its own. Its claims are rational because its creator gave it ideas that were rational from the creator's perspective. The Magic 8 Ball, on the other hand, comes to irrational conclusions, even though it, within itself, has as much justification for its claims as the calculator does within itself. They both have presuppositions, and they come to conclusions based on their presuppositions. The calculator has presuppositions about binary logic. The Magic 8 Ball has presuppositions about buoyancy and gravity, thinking that buoyancy plus gravity plus a 12-sided die can come up with the right answer to any question. So they both have their own presuppositions, and they both work according to their own presuppositions, and they both come to conclusions based on their presuppositions. But the presuppositions of the Magic 8 Ball are flawed, and in the sense of a rational flaw. They're not rational assumptions. The creator of the Magic 8 Ball wanted it to behave in an irrational manner. The creator of the calculator wanted it to behave in a rational manner. And as a result of that desire on the part of the creator, that's what determines the rationality of the conclusions of these two different devices, the desire of the creator. Likewise, we can talk about, so that's sort of one example. If we just put that aside for just a minute, and talk about a different example, and then I'm going to kind of tie them together as best I can. Talking about a different example, we go back to Mark Twain and Tom Sawyer. If a person wants to know what color Tom Sawyer's eyes are, and they go to Mark Twain and they say, "Hey, Mark, what color are Tom Sawyer's eyes? You know, I love your character. I love these novels. I love reading them, but I'm really wondering what color his eyes are. I can't picture him in my head without knowing the color of his eyes." And so Mark Twain says, "Blue." Well, guess what? Tom Sawyer's eyes are blue. And Mark Twain's claim that Tom Sawyer's eyes are blue is totally justified based solely upon Mark Twain's will. On the other hand, you could go to Stephen King and ask him the same question. "Hey, Steve, what color are Tom Sawyer's eyes?" If Stephen King says blue, you'd be like, "Why do you think they're blue? What led you to that conclusion?" The fact that Stephen King wants them to be blue isn't sufficient, because his will is not that which justifies the claim of the color of Tom Sawyer's eyes. But Mark Twain's will is. Mark Twain's will does justify that. So, and in fact, it's sort of a final justification, in the sense of if a person comes to a conclusion, it seems to me that people generally believe that conclusions are not justified unless the premises are justified. But what justifies the premises? Well, maybe their conclusions of prior premises. Well, that means that for them to be justified, the premises for them would have to be justified. And you keep walking back. You don't really have a justified conclusion unless all of the premises all the way back down the line are all justified. But at the end of that, at least in the case of Tom Sawyer's eye color, at the end of that, you wind up with Mark Twain's will. And that's the end. Mark Twain wants it to be that Tom Sawyer's eyes are blue. Therefore, the claim that he makes that Tom Sawyer's eyes are blue is fully and finally rationally justified, and there's no more challenge to that in terms of a rational challenge. Whereas the claim that Stephen King makes is insufficient because his will doesn't actually make the fact a reality. So it seems to me that we can keep asking the question, why do you think this? Why do you think this? Why do you think this? Until we get to the will. And if the will actually does make the fact a fact, then we've hit the end point and we've got a full final rational justification. But if we don't ever get to will, if we don't ever get to desire as the source of the claim, then we don't ever actually have a rational justification. So with these two examples, it seems to me that by combining them, we wind up with a model in which our claims can be justified by appealing to our creator, like the calculator, and they can be fully and finally justified if they meet the the creator's will, our creator's will. So walking that path back until you get to the will is the endpoint of rational justification. And if there is no will that makes facts facts, in other words, if there is no God, then there is no rational justification for the vast majority of things that we claim. There would still perhaps possibly be rational justification for Mark Twain's claim that Tom Sawyer has blue eyes, but there wouldn't be rational justification for Stephen King's claim that Tom Sawyer has blue eyes. He could appeal to Mark Twain's will, but in order to do that, he would have to utilize the world that they both exist in, coexist in, and he would have to assume all kinds of things about the existence of Mark Twain, and ultimately he would have to appeal to God's will to get those assumptions justified. So without the will of God, it seems to me that there is no final justification for anything, and things that we typically consider justified can't be without there being a God, without will. without the will of God behind those things. I don't know if that made any sense at all.
I think it did. So it seems like you're asking for absolute certainty, like we can absolutely be
No, not
certain
at all.
that Tom
I'm
Sawyer's eyes are blue because his author said so. I mean, yeah, okay.
I'm not asking for absolute certainty. I'm just simply looking at justification. What justifies a claim?
Well, yeah, it seems like what you require for a claim to be justified is absolute certainty. Like we
Nope,
had the
not at
author
all.
did this. Because, for example, you said that for something to be reasonable, it depends on the creator's design of the thing. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, for example, if I created a magic eight ball and I shook the magic eight ball and it gave me a list of numbers and I put those numbers in and won the lottery and I did it again and again and again, I would be rationally justified in believing the eight ball can predict the lotteries. It doesn't matter who created it, doesn't matter why they created it. It's completely irrelevant. I can say, because of my experience, I am rationally justified that this eight ball can predict that experience. Creators are irrelevant entirely from rationality.
Well, even talking about experience depends upon appealing to somebody's will.
Right? But that doesn't matter rationality. Rationality isn't important to that.
Talking about experience rationally depends upon appealing to somebody's will, the will of the one who created the realm in which you have the experience. Otherwise, you can't even talk about the experience rationally.
No, we can talk about the experience rationally about somebody else. Like on Africa, some kid is hungry. Like we're rationally talking about his experience. We don't have his experience though.
But in order for me to say that your claim in Africa, somebody's hungry, is justified, in order for me to be confident that it is rationally justified, I would have to ask you what makes you think that there in Africa some kid is hungry. And then you would have to explain how you came to that conclusion. And then you would have to explain how you came to the premises that led to that conclusion. And then you would have to explain how you came to those premises and how you came to those premises and how you came to those premises. And in the end, ultimately, you're going to appeal to something like universal invariant non-contradiction, or our experiences are generally reliable, or some other thing that you can't really demonstrate through your own logic, through your own power. You've got to simply appeal to some sort of law that transcends you that you didn't make true.
Well, right. That's where I'm disagreeing. So no, that's false. I can just list the premises and say this argument is valid, and just say, okay, we're done. So I can say like,
Okay.
a kid is hungry because whatever facts I list, and or like in an argument, I can just list the premises, say A equals B, B equals C, therefore C equals A, and say, okay, well, this is rational simply because it's the way I've defined the language to work.
Okay, so rationality is merely your definition. It is whatever you say it is. Is that it's based on your will?
No, it's based off of can the premises lead to the conclusion?
Okay, so you think that the premises could be totally insane, and is as long as the conclusion follows from them by deductive necessity, even though you can't justify deductive necessity as even being a thing, then the conclusion is rationally justified, even though it's not justified because deductive necessity isn't justified and the premises aren't justified. They're totally insane.
If you define rationality as the conclusion follows from the premises, yes, that's rational.
I would agree with you. And what I'm saying is I don't think that most people define it that way in common conversation. When we talk about, for example, if somebody said the sky is blue, and I say, well, what led you to that conclusion? And they say, well, all number sevens are blue and the sky is the number seven. Well, the conclusion follows from the premises, and I would immediately conclude that this guy is insane and he has no clue what he's talking about. His conclusion that the sky is blue may be true and it may follow from the premises, but it's not rational. I would never call that rational. Would you call it rational?
No, but again, rationality in common usage is applied to empirical sense experience and common people's data. It doesn't actually have anything to do with rationality, because rationality is purely a logical concept, like does the conclusion follow from the premises? So those are two different things. For something to be rational, you don't need the sense experience part. That's not what rationality entails. So comparing rationality to how people mostly use it in society doesn't tell us anything about rationality at all. It just tells us what most people have sense experience for. That's all it tells us. And what most people have sense experience for is what most people call rational. But that isn't a rational basis for anything.
So I don't agree with you. I think that most people recognize that the sense experience of a lunatic does not lead to rational conclusions for that lunatic. I don't think that people identify sense experience with rationality.
Well, that's exactly what they're doing. That's what you just said, though, is that the reason we call someone a lunatic is because we have all this sense experience that contradicts what he's saying. So it's literally just most of us have this sense experience, therefore he's a lunatic. So based off your definition of how most people use rational, how most people use rational is just most people experience this, he experiences something different, he's a lunatic. That's not a good way to define rationality.
So again, first of all, that's not obviously how I'm defining rationality. You're saying that you think that that's what my my model of looking at how other people define it would lead to. Is that correct?
No, you said like how most people use the term rational. How most people use the term rational is if it departs from common experience, it's irrational. That's just how most people use the term rational in common discourse. It's so the reason we think person X is a lunatic is because what they're saying departs from common experience. That's how most people use the term rational. I don't know if it's specifically
agree with you on that. At least that hasn't been. I don't think that's been my experience. And maybe by most people, I mean a whole different category of people than you're referring to. Anyway, it seems to me that when I encounter folks, they put things into certain categories. There's the category of the irrational claim and the category of the rational claim. And when I try to figure out what makes those elements fit into those categories, I wind up with the conclusion of will. And that leads me to the conclusion of God. So for me personally, it seems like if the world that we live in is the world that we think that we live in, then it's a monotheistic universe. That's what it seems like to me.
Well, there's a couple of problems with that. One is that will doesn't tell us anything about the will. Like God could just be an evil demon who's deceiving us all for fun. I mean, the will there doesn't help us at all. And will doesn't seem to have anything to do with rationalities. Because again, I'm rational to believe that tornadoes hurt things. Tornadoes don't have a will of any kind. I'm rational to believe that if I flip a coin and it gets 50% heads and tails, that it's a fair coin. Has nothing to do with will. Or a rock and just a random thing. Same thing. Like will is just irrelevant to rationality, and except in specific contexts where you're asking about someone's will. Like, do you like cheese? Yes, I do like cheese. Okay, that's a good justification to believe that person likes cheese because they said so. But other than those cases, it's completely irrelevant. Like, rationality has nothing to do with will except in cases where you're asking about a will. So saying that rationality entails a will is just begging the question.
Well, I disagree, because I think that with your examples that you would say do not involve will, if I was to point out to someone, like let's say that you said, well, the sky is blue. And so now I might talk to a variety of different people, and they might all say, oh yeah, that's a perfectly rational claim. But then if I posit the idea that I asked you why you think the sky is blue, and you said it's because all number sevens are blue and the sky is the number 7. And then I asked them the same question. Now, do you still think his claim that the sky is blue is rational? They would all say, no, it's not. So even though it matches their sense experience, they would agree that the sky is blue. I think they would all agree that it's not a rational claim that you made if you made it on the basis of the whole number 7 thing, which is insane in their minds. So
right, I agree with that completely. But that's when I said what makes it rational is does the conclusion fall from the premises? Like if all the number 7s are blue, that premise does not lead to the conclusion the sky is blue. That's why it's irrational. But
well, if you have the two premises, all number 7s are blue and the sky is the number 7, and you combine those, then you would come to the conclusion that the sky is blue. It would be a rational conclusion.
It would be valid.
A rational conclusion is one that, yeah, it would be valid.
But yeah, if we had actual sense experience that contradicted that, that's what would make it not valid. Because again, that's what I said earlier, is that most people use the term rational to correspond to their empirical experience, because we have experience of the sky being blue and 7s aren't the sky. There's no causal relation between those two things. That's what would make it irrational, is because there's a defeater in the fact that we doesn't correlate to our experience. So I don't see how that works. Like, for example, we could say if someone experienced the sky was blue and they were asked, is the sky blue? And they said yes. Would they be rational to conclude that? Well, the answer would be yes. Now, we don't actually, there's no person here. We've talked nothing about experience. This is purely hypothetical. If someone experienced the sky was blue and were asked if it was blue and said yes, would they be reasonable? Yes, they would. So we can understand the rationality has not to do with the experience but simply the causal relation to if they experience something, are they reasonable to conclude inference from that? And the answer is yes. So it doesn't necessarily have to do with the experience there, or the will.
Well, but again, I think looking at the categories that people have, if the lunatic experiences the unicorn in front of him, people would say that it's not a rational conclusion that there's a unicorn in front of him anyway, even though he's experienced it. So I don't think that people equate, I mean, from my personal experience, I don't think that people equate the concept of rationality with empirical experience, like you're saying that they do. I don't think that that's accurate.
I'm not sure why, because if I showed someone a unicorn and they weren't a lunatic, they would conclude, "Are you rationally believe in unicorns?" They'd be like, "Yes, that's a unicorn." So if most people saw unicorns, they'd be like, "Would that person be a unicorn for a lunatic for believing in unicorns?" Well, no, because most people see unicorns. So it seems like that's exactly how they're defining it. Because if you show someone a unicorn and you let them pet it and ride it, then they're going to be rationally justified in believing there's a unicorn.
Okay. Are you saying that the empirical experiences of most people, sort of the agreement of society or whatever, on what constitute normative experiences would justify then a claim that somebody has experienced something? Is that kind of what you're saying? So
Maybe I think so. Like if I said I saw a dog, then yes, that would be reasonable to believe. Just based off my testimony, you would be reasonable in believing me.
right. Okay. So yeah, if you said I saw a dog, and I said, oh, okay, that sounds totally rational to me, I would put that in the rational category. But then if I asked you what made you come to the conclusion that you saw a dog, and you said, well, because I was staring at my grandma and she was really ugly, therefore I saw a dog, I would then conclude that either what you meant by I saw a dog is not what I thought you meant, or if in fact you meant what I did think you mean, that there's no reason to think that you saw a dog. You didn't see a dog, you were looking at your grandma. And so now your claim that you saw a dog, even though it matches my experience that dogs exist and that I've seen them, I would suddenly think, okay, there's something wrong in this guy's head. His conclusion doesn't follow from his own personal experience, or even if it does follow from his personal experience, it seems to be somehow irrational foundationally. Anyway, I guess the point that I'm getting at is, even if there's an immediate appearance of justification for a claim, that claim may prove to be unjustified as a person continues to ask well, why do you think that? Why do you think that? Why do you think that kind of a question? And I think that that's the case I think that that's the case in most people's minds. And if that is in fact the reality that we live in, then that path goes all the way back until it gets to will, or else it doesn't ever get anywhere. And you wind up with, well, this is never really justified because there's never any justification for it at the back of it. Will can justify things. I think we all agree will can justify things. You acknowledged that. Okay, so, but I'm not sure that there is anything else. In fact, it seems like nothing has to behave the way that we want it to behave unless it has to behave the way that we want it to behave. And that can be the only justification for claiming that it behaves that way, in final justification, not necessarily sort of an immediate appearance of justification. That's what it seems like to me. And to me, this is a very convincing
Oh yeah, I'd agree with all that. That makes I'm fine with that. But I'd say that we do have justification. Like I think therefore I am. That gives me logic and math. From logic and math, I can use inferences and experience things and then make causal relations, which gives me justification for everything in the natural world. So I think, as far as I can tell, I have ground logical justification for everything, all my beliefs.
Okay, I hear you, and I don't have any reason to doubt your sincerity, but I definitely disagree with you. I think that there are lots of presuppositions that go into I think therefore I am, and even if there weren't, I think that the claim itself is unjustified because it's not based on anything. It's not based on any kind of rational justification. It's a claim out of the blue. If there's no rational justification for it, then there's no rational justification for it. If there's no reason behind it, then there's no reason behind it. And when we eliminate God, we ultimately eliminate reason behind all of our first premises. And so I think therefore I am couldn't have any reason behind it if there is no God, if it is in fact a starting point. Now, I don't think that it is a starting point. I think that there are things behind it, like the assumption of implication or the assumption of non-contradiction or whatever. I think that there are several things behind it. So I don't really think that it's a starting point. But if it were, it would be a starting point that's not based in will, and therefore it's not based in reason. It's absent will, it's absent reason. That would be my perspective on it. Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So from my perspective, will has nothing to do with rationality. You don't need will at all for rationality. And the fact that we experience I exist is prior to rationality. Rationality follows from that. So you don't actually need rationality to justify it. Like brute facts are totally a thing. You don't need rationality to justify brute facts. They're just brute facts. So it seems to me that you're begging the question when you're imposing rationality requires will. I don't think that's necessary at all. Like it definitely can be if you wrote a character, that's totally fine. But there doesn't seem to be any reason to conclude that's a good way to define rationality in every case. It just seems very strange. But that's the difference in our positions, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So we've been going for about 2 hours. Probably time to start wrapping up anyway. But thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the
You're
time.
getting sick of me, huh? That's okay. I can deal with that.
I got to go anyway because I've got an appointment at 1. So
okay. Well, it's been a great conversation. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry if I was incoherent at times. I appreciate you bearing with me.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. I'll talk to you later.
All right. Sounds good.
Bye.